Hello everyone, welcome to History for Roleplayers. Today I want to talk a little bit about Robert E. Howard, specifically his Conan adventures and the different countries in history that actually helped inspire them. Now Robert E. Howard wrote 26 stories, but he also left many of them unfinished on Conan. He wrote in several different genres, but Conan is the one that actually created the concept of sword and sorcery. Now, maybe Edgar Rice Burroughs can share the credit, but that author had more of a sci-fi bent to his themes, and John Carter, of course, is no Conan. Conan is the classic fighter, warrior, the savage hero. He is just the guy there for slaughter and there to rescue the damsel. It's an old trope, but for Howard, it was really the first time the trope was being used in a magic and medieval / ancient setting. Conan will only kill in self-defense. You can go into the stories. He was never really an assassin, like James Bond, probably the other character of movies and stories that shares as much fame. But he did kill many who took the first blow against him, and he never lost any fight that he was in. Now, Howard also wrote about Kull the Conqueror, Red Sonja, Valeria, and there were a number of other sword and sorcery heroes mentioned. I also like his Solomon Kane. Conan was the one that stood out and is the one that has, more than anything, stood the test of time. Just as an aside, Howard wrote hundreds upon hundreds, probably 200 short stories that were published in his short lifetime, and he left probably another 100 unfinished drafts. So take a lesson, lads. If you want to write, you should be writing. Don't stop, and make no excuses for yourself. Maybe I'm just saying that to myself. Howard certainly was influenced by Kipling and Jack London. He did not attend college to study literature. He was a working man. He was also an amateur boxer. If you really want to know more about Robert E. Howard, and it is a fascinating short life, you should check out the movie The Whole Wide World. Now, when Howard wrote his Conan stories, he never wrote a map. He essentially was looking at various history books that he was very fond of reading, and he picked in pieces out certain aspects of different countries that he read about. But the fans themselves put together a composite map based on his description of how Conan was moving around the world. Conan as well ended up in the first Gods and Demigod books of TSR, although I think the copyright law caught up with them and they had to remove them. I believe Conan was a 20th level fighter and 20th level thief, a dual class with a few other magical elements. But Conan himself was not a user of magic. In fact, he was superstitious and hated magic. A lot of the stories related to Conan meeting some sort of magic or magic source and eventually defeating it. This probably also had a little bit of the of Howard living a man in his age, early 20th century, and witches were still seen as something that would be anathema. Now, Howard wrote a lot, but unfortunately, he died. He took his own life, sadly. Later authors and comics and movies expanded his canon, and all are rather respectful, and all are decent reads or decent watching. There's a few purists that only stick to Howard, but I think Conan in general is a character that, especially with public domain, has become immortal in literature and in entertainment. The latest movie may have been a little bit of a bust, but it is what it is. And twice there were Saturday morning cartoon shows, first with Conan leading a D&D style group of different character classes, and the second he was, the reboot, he was leading a couple of kids and teaching them life lessons. Saturday morning cartoons were at least as good as the cartoon track, and I think that's high compliment from me. Of any other writer, he was the one that inspired Dungeons & Dragons, and maybe we should all take a moment to pause and reflect on that. There's a lot of people who say that, no, Dungeons & Dragons were based on such and such, and that, no, when somebody will even claim, no, I've never read Robert E. Howard, and my ideas were totally my own. It's all a little bull and naive. D&D has more aspects of the Conan universe and Conan character than it certainly has of any Tolkien sort of mythos. But just like James Bond, which I mentioned before, Conan was a solo hero. His stories are not group play. He might join a few other individuals or pair up with somebody for a brief period of time, but by the end of the story, you knew that they were going to separate, and Conan had another fate in store for him. Now, there are plenty of gaps, actually, in his life, but online I found a list of all the works written about Conan, and it pieced together a timeline. It's actually sort of fascinating to look at. The way I look at Conan is it's basically a lot of minstrels, a lot of bards, a lot of storytellers that are telling stories on winter nights to their king in ages long past the hero's life. They're making these stories sort of flow without a need for a strict continuity, and I like that. Each person telling the story to his king and his kingdom will add his own flourishes, and will misremember the legends, or add more to them. And it's basically a nice character for people to draw these tales upon. The first place that's mentioned is Conan's birthplace, Cimmeria. He doesn't actually return there very much. In some of the interpretations, it's actually a country that gets overrun and destroyed. But the Chimers were actual people, and they actually had a country for a little while. It was nestled between a number of countries that appear after the collapse of the Hittites. Now, we're talking about 700 BC, thereabouts. Now, depending upon the archaeological record, the Chimer either were a subgroup, probably a minority group within the Assyrian Empire that emigrated out to form their own kingdom, or they were akin to the Scythians, and they came on their own, as many cultures and races of people had, from Central Asia, past Caspian Sea, and then down into the area of eastern Turkey, northern Iran, and from there they set up their own kingdom. Conan is actually has a lot of moralistic underpinnings. He's the savage with a code, and the Cimmerians themselves are not very well described in the sagas. I do not think as a country they had much written records. Yeah, when you talk about 700 BC and before, if you can believe it, there wasn't really even coinage. Later on, a kingdom, Phrygia, which was almost a contemporary of the Chimer and their people, would come along and invent coinage, and those precious metals then would lead to, like, the fable of King Midas turning his own people into gold. Conan's capital was Aquilonia, which is more of an Arthurian-style kingdom with chivalry, surrounded by people that hated them. You can picture this as ancient Wessex or Mercia, a post-Roman vacuum country that was created before the Vikings invaded and the Anglo-Saxons invaded and eventually the Normans invaded. And again, it would probably be not, in the case of these Arthurian stories of Wessex and Mercia, this would not be 700 BC like Cimmeria, but this would be more like 700 AD, close to 1400 years later. The place Conan would eventually conquer is Aquilonia, and he would do it through usurpation. And that usurpation was really never fully described in detail. It was perhaps around the age of 46, around the story Hour of the Dragon. The story also has him defending his kingdom in some of the later tales by modern authors, more of Conan the Avenger. And of course, this reminds me of the Marvel What If, Thor versus Conan. Conan as a mortal can't actually climb the mountain and meet the god Crom, but Thor can. Phoenix on the Sword is Howard's story about Conan in Tarentia, his capital, and when he was king. Now, one of the major enemies of Aquilonia was Nemedia. Now, Media was a wizardry-run theocracy. Now, it sounds very Roman, and it probably was based on the Roman Empire. It had Mitra as a sun god deity, same as historic Rome. Nemedia was a constant war, gathering up other countries and other countries' mercenaries to try to invade. I think they even captured him at the border or tricked him and ended up capturing him. But you can't hold Conan for long. One of the worst things you can do to Conan is put him in chains. It's like just giving him another set of flails he can fight with. Gibbon was a historic writer, and he wrote a long treatise on Rome, and it probably, since it was probably in every library, was something that Howard read. Now, I don't know that for sure, but it sounds like Howard read enough of Gibbon to know that the Roman Empire was a mess. And so Nemedia itself was a mess of different dictators and tyrants and bad kings and effete kings and abomination kings. And so Conan coming in as sort of this proto-chivalric Arthurian type of leader who would come in and form his own country and face Nemedia as a, essentially a place that was ungovernable. You have stories about Nemedia like the God in the Bowl and Rogues in the House, a Hand of Nergal, and in which Conan is basically, he starts off fighting and ends up in a minor intrigue where he's defeating either a magic user or some sort of monster. Stygia is the next country I'll talk about, and it's a perfect representation of Egypt with magic. It's full of mummery and priestly type castes, and as part of Africa, it has sort of this remote foreignness. It's the place where he and Belit, his one true love, were trying to rob, or places where in the stories Conan is trying to rescue some girlie from being sacrificed. That sort of chivalry comes into place, but also has this chauvinistic, I will rape you by your own choice, is the way I would describe it. And that fits in well with Robert E. Howard's 1920s Texas that he grew up in. It was definitely seen, women didn't even have the vote yet. And so it was definitely seen as a man's world, and men had to defend their families. There are many stories in the Western tradition about how when the Indians attacked, the last shot in the pistol was saved to kill your own wife. Nowadays that would seem ridiculous, but get her a rifle to fight with. But back then it was just sort of the tale that the lone gunman on the plain. And the same was true as a style of writing that Howard was writing about. But Stygian again was a place where you could just have unbelievable evil without actually explicitly describing what that evil is. It was just enough to say that you had a gal chained to an altar awaiting sacrifice. It just conjured up all sorts of images. Turan. Now, Turan was supposedly founded by adventurers, and it definitely had sort of a Western influence, yet it was in the Far East. So I picture this as like the Crusader lands. Now, the Crusader lands only lasted maybe 100 years through 3 kings. They were exotic and ancient cities, all the way back to biblical times, Jerusalem, Antioch, Tyre. These were all places that the Norman Crusaders eventually would capture and hold on to for, as I said, about 100 years before the Arab Muslim states would kick them out again. Turan represented a country that was big. It described an area in it that was like the Caspian Sea that their own warships would patrol. There was adventures in his middle life of Conan took place maybe around 20, where he's either fighting for their army, fighting as a mercenary in the service, or ends up losing that position through intrigue, and then the tale splits off to some sort of sword and sorcery horror. The Black Kingdoms are mentioned, and this would be more like in Africa and Zimbabwe, Timbuktu, with a heavy influence of sinister magic. From that land would come very powerful wizards, and Robert E. Howard, again as a Texan, would live in his own, a very different social climate than we have today. Conan's one love was Belit, and she would lead him in sort of a Heart of Darkness style adventure, a slow sail up the river to where they would meet the undead and be damned for her goal, not his. Vanaheim is a Dane, a German Viking setting, which Conan adventured in. These would be the Goth warriors. It was also described as a land of giants and the Norse mythology. The Heroes of Aesgaard probably was a book in every library that Robert E. Howard read. These were places where glaciers, and it was bleak. It was almost a dark place of wolves. But it was also the coming-of-age tales for Conan. And it also, for instance, in the Frost Giant's daughter is Howard's story. It was the Frost Giant's daughter was the inspiration for many a Frazetta poster, and nothing captured Conan better than Frazetta. I think they've even said that the Ace paperbacks, if I'm getting that wrong, forgive me, but the Ace paperbacks, the sales on them were just totally fueled by the fact that the Frazetta artwork was selling Conan on the cover. If you don't know who Frazetta is, if you're a younger person, do an internet search, and of course, if you're an old guy like me, of course you know Frazetta. Aesgaard. Aesgaard was the Vikings. Aesgaard doesn't, it's mentioned. It's sort of mentioned interchangeably with Vanaheim. Sometimes Conan would be siding with Aesir, raiding the Vanaheim. This could be like a Danish Viking versus a Norse or Swedish Viking. Maybe a Viking style that was settled more permanently, Anglo-Saxon in the English. But these are again more in the comic books are drawn as the guys with the horns on their skull, which of course the archaeologists have said that no, there were not horned, helmeted Norsemen at any time in history, but it worked well on Hollywood. The Aesgaard, the Vanaheim, were all both seen as at various times as enemies of the Cimmeria, even though historically the two places would be thousands of miles and many climates different apart. Zamora. Zamora is sort of a North African, Moroccan, sort of Berber tradition. There's many an exotic trading capital in the tales, towers to climb, heavily featured in that Arnold movie. It continues his tale as a thief versus the sorcerer in things like the Tower of the Elephant. Zamora with Morocco with its Berber influence, the Arabs with inspired by both a need for empire and also by their religion, expanded all the way across Africa and into Spain, and that influence would be seen with the minarets of the temples. And Zamora would be sort of the 20th century author from Texas's viewpoint of an exotic religion loaded with gold, but loaded with sacrifice as well. Barachan Islands. Now, the Barachan Islands, more of a Caribbean theme, almost Port Royal, Jamaica under British rule. It had sea dogs and pirates and alehouses. It could also have been Venice, but again, it would have been much later. If you talk about Aesgaard being Vikings from the 700 AD and Zamora being Berbers from perhaps 800, 900,000 AD, and then the Barachan Islands would take you up to 1500 AD. There's a huge span here. But again, Howard is sort of taking the ideas of these different countries and using them as settings for Conan and his adventures. And certainly Howard loved that idea of the swashbuckler Conan sailing the seas and raiding like Blackbeard. And the crew, of course, only follows him after he kills the first captain. And of course, who wouldn't follow a hero who can slay with every one of his sword blows? They mention a border kingdom of marshes and Neanderthals, mostly unexplored. I can picture Florida, especially Florida in the time of Ponce de Leon, where it would be seen as something wild. The Creek Indians were essentially massacred by Andrew Jackson, a president, and yet Andrew Jackson was lauded. And certainly Robert E. Howard is a Texan in his day. Jackson, I'm not sure when Jackson was put on the $20 bill, but it was probably about that time. He would be seen as a very, very manly, aggressive president, and Florida was just a place that needed slaughter. In the same way, the border kingdom in the Conan stories as a sort of Native American, Aboriginal, Floridian area would be seen as a swamp place that just needed a slaughter. I think it's mentioned more by later authors, the Border Kingdom, than it is by Howard in his original. In a story like The Bloodstained God, it takes place in an area where Conan was more in his formative years. It sort of before he meets Belit and goes on adventures in the heart of Africa. They mention Pickland. Pickland is the Scots, but it's probably the ancient Scots, more of a Druid tradition. I spent, a whole hour talking about the Druids, so, the blue-painted berserkers. We won't go much into that, except for the fact that Howard also, in many of his stories, sort of has a malignant hatred of the Apache and the Sioux. I think he respects them for their ferocity, but he doesn't see them as anything more than people that Conan should slaughter. You take, for instance, beyond the Black River. There's no motive on either side for these attacks. You're just, I guess because Conan is where he is, the people of the Black River attack the Picts, and because Conan is attacked, he kills the people, the Picts. He actually, by the prose, actually kills them rather easily too, so despite the fact that Howard may have respected Native Americans trying to defend their homelands, he certainly was not timid about slaughter, if not genocide. Hyperborea. Now, Hyperborea is an odd place. I think it's only mentioned mostly in passing by Howard, and a lot of the later authors really picked up on it. It sort of has this river Styx feel. It's almost a duplicate of Egypt and Stygia, except it exists more in a medieval witchcraft sort of angry city of Troy, very heavy magic feel. I would place it in Western Turkey. It could be maybe the Persian Empire, and if you've seen the movie 300, the wildness of that, was it Xerxes or was it Darius? One of the two kings of Persia who attacked the 300 Spartans. You can see the variety of his entourage and his mercenary forces, and that too I think would come into play with Hyboria, a stylized form. In real Persia was a marvelous empire in the way it expanded and the way it assimilated. You could also have a little bit of Hyperborea in the Mitanni client state. Mitanni was a small, independent country that was a client state of Egypt. It essentially only existed because Egypt said anyone to invade Mitanni was going to suffer the wrath of Egypt. Mitanni predated the Phrygians, who controlled, again back to King Midas, those Phrygians, who predated the Assyrians just by a little bit, and inherited the mantle of the Hittite Empire when it fell apart. There's just so many countries in history that grew, thrived, and disappeared, and very few of them were assimilated. Most of them were massacred out of existence. Anyone who thinks that humans are peaceful people is just not reading their history. You have the Vanish state as well, Vanish state, that is in Turkey around 700 BC, around the time that Cimmeria also is a country. And these are all places that later just get conquered by the Assyrians, one of the bloodiest people to exist. There's actually, there isn't a whole lot of magic inside of Conan. It's not D&D with spell books by any stretch of the imagination. The superstition of Conan and his hatred for magic is actually is more of a style that I enjoy play. You'll see it in some of the games that I write. I would rather not have an abundance of what I call the +1 winky magic items that just add to your dice roll, and I would rather see magic be involved more in a ritual than in something that can be seen in somebody's hands. Although with a game like Outlands, and certainly with Rogue Swords, the exceptions were made. But the place, basically, Hyperborea, is a place that Conan often crosses, but he doesn't stay often. He certainly does not fight for them or fight against them in any sort of noticeable form. The Thing in the Crypt perhaps comes to mind as an exception to that rule, but again, the Thing in the Crypt is more Conan trying to cross an expansive area and ending up falling into a tomb, and the original occupant comes alive. You have Argos. Argos definitely has a Greek theme, but certainly not an Athenian theme. This would be the Greece of the Peloponnesian League, run by Sparta, although Sparta was never really mentioned in the Conan saga. You have sort of a number of Greek city-states that are banded together to, for self-defense and for trade. They probably share a similar culture, a similar set of gods, a similar language, and all that, just like in the Achaean Peninsula is what the ancient Greeks had. But it's as a nation, it's more placeholder in Conan. It's a place that he marches an army across or sails a ship from. It's not really anything except an afterthought at the end of the story that now I'm off to raid in Argos. Now I'm off to pillage the ships of Argos. Bithynia. Now, Bithynia is sort of the other half of Argos, where Argos is the Greeks except the Athenians. Bithynia definitely has an Athenian, Athens sort of flair. There's an arrogance to it, a need for control. It may have a little bit of Macedonian or Theban influence, but I don't think Howard would have been influenced by them. It sounds more like what was written by Thucydides, another author that would be in every library, and a very approachable author. He's very readable, and he's writing from a very human standpoint of what it was like to be in a Greek hoplite and in fighting 150 versus 75 in the aftermath from that, and all of the internal politics in Athens. And that all comes out, I think, a little bit in Brithunia. There's sort of this a legacy of the idea that they have to defend their border, and Brithunia has a lot of borders. It's, I would compare it to like China on a risk map. It has, I believe, 7 connecting nations, all of them hotspots of which it shares a border with. And of course, it also borders with Hyperborea. So in the Conan stories, there you would extrapolate and know that the magic of Hyperborea was causing mischief all the time in Brithunia. Corinthia. Now, Corinthia, of all things, is not based on Corinth. Now, Corinth is a city-state in ancient Greek. It's probably still a city today, and it's right at that sort of isthmus, that peninsula that connects the lower Achaean Peninsula. I think it's even called the Peloponnesian Peninsula, with the rest of Europe. It would be a choke spot, so if you control Corinth, you could control trade in 2 directions, east or west. I'm surprised they've never built a canal across it, although I'd have to go to Google Maps to see if the Greeks and modern Greeks did. But Corinthia in the tales, the way it's described, it seems more Frankish or Swiss mercenary. It's basically a land of farmlands and thieves. It's a place crossed without any interest. Since Robert E. Howard would basically have a very English, very Arthurian-centric version of his tales, you can see why, if it is Frankish, if it is French, just like many people today, we discredit the French for everything that they've offered the world. I probably should do a history of role players just on the French, but I know I got to do one on the Roman and Roman Republic especially, so that people can start adding a little bit more honest intrigue with their politics rather than this sort of catch-and-catch-can assassination and usurpation of kingdoms. But Corinth is not a Greek city-state in the tales, except for in one modern novel, where I think the author read the word Corinthia, did his search, and just naturally added a Greek bent to it. But Corinthia, again, it just feels more Swiss, mountains, and more Frankish, French countryside than it would be anything to do with the Greeks. So I don't think Corinthia as a Greek city is anything to do with Howard's canon. Afghanistan, it's very close to Afghanistan, isn't it? Afghanistan is basically related to Kipling. Now, Kipling was not a contemporary of Howard, but there's no way he didn't read Kipling. I think I've even read in biographies of Howard how much he mentioned Kipling, and I'm a lover of Kipling as well. I can get past the misogyny and the racism and the feeling of the white man's burden and all that, and I just see Kipling as a teller of sort of ripping yarns. And Afghanistan is someplace that would have been unchanged since Alexander had conquered. It's a place like the man who would be king. It's at the foot of great mountains, Afghanistan, just on the foot of great mountains. It contains a very proud people that just don't want to be governed and just want to be left alone. And yet constantly people are coming in there and telling them how to live their lives. Now, Howard is not writing directly about the place in any of his own stories. He's more paying homage and also adding this connectivity to Kipling's use of the historic places. And again, that's just one author. For Howard, he's thinking that he's hoping to grab a little bit of the fame of Kipling. But I think now, at least in our day and age, when you think of a classic story, Conan beats the hell out of Jungle Book. I like them both. But the Kipling tales are sort of falling out of favor, where Conan is, and his legacy of Sword and Sorcery is riding strong. I'll move on to Bossonia. Let me check really quick on my time. We're doing pretty well. We might even get ahead of the game. I've been going so long-winded. You'll have to forgive me. Of course, you can always pause the video, come back to it, or just cancel out. Bossonia. Bossonia is interesting because they mention it a number of times on how clever the people are and how mercenary the state is. Bossonian archers, the most famous archers in the world. And there actually is an organic equivalent to that. The Roman Empire used Armenia. Armenia, exactly where it is. It's, sort of in the area of southern Turkey at the time of the Romans, but it also extended to where Armenia as a modern country exists in the former Soviet Union, southern there, a little bit north of Turkey. But that area contained a people that were eager to assimilate, yet constantly warlike in their attitude. And it was perfect for the Romans. The Romans recruited Armenians as their auxiliary forces and later brought them directly into their legions. And this is what you see as well from Bossonia. I think sort of the Armenian mercenaries are also mentioned in Gibbon, so it would be another subtle hint that Robert E. Howard had read his Gibbon. Like any good historian, you got to have read your Gibbon and known about the Roman Empire. But Armenia, it sort of has this minority religion. It's always had a minority religion, even as it's changed religion. It's a Christian country now, but back then it would have had its own Zoroastrian influences. It was a place that the Romans could depend upon, that if they needed mercenaries or they needed reliable fighters, they could always go to Armenia and bring them in. There are some authors that have written essays, historians, on how the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, when it split both east and west, and lost this access to Armenia and the fighters of Armenia. That was the beginning of the end. When the Western Roman leaders had to start relying on mercenaries, true foreign mercenaries who were sworn to Gothic kings, rather than having this reliable place they can recruit soldiers. Now, I hope it's not too controversial if I'm going to say that the South in the United States is a great place where we recruit soldiers for our modern armed forces. You just add a little bit of poverty with a little bit of tradition of family and country, and you have a steady source of young men that will give their lives, and proud men as well. And I think that's what you have with Bossonia, that's what you have with Armenia. Zingara, Zingara doesn't get the screen time that Zamora has. Zamora has a better ring to it, but Zingara would probably be of the Muslim-influenced Spanish. At one time, the Moors invaded and took over Spain, and they were sort of following the reverse path of the Carthaginians. They were trying to reclaim land. They took Naples and Sicily, and they were going to try to take all of Italy, including the Vatican. And they invaded France, and if it wasn't for Charles Martel at a famous battle outside of Tours, this one moment in history, a French king drove the Muslims out of Western Europe. Now, they tried for another probably 500 to 1,000 years to advance all the way up. There was even a siege in Austria by the Ottoman Empire. But when Zingara would represent that sort of influence of this foreign nation that was in an area that it shouldn't exist. It's also a placeholder nation on the coast. Conan crosses it, when he's on his way to a more lively and more exotic location like Stygia. Kozakai, very close to Cossack in name, and it probably was a Cossack theme. It also showed the range of borrowing that Robert E. Howard used, because the Cossacks did not appear as a people until the 1600s. And yet we're also talking about Cimmeria as a country was 700 BC. So you have 2,500 years, huge amount of time between the two countries. But he was again looking for more of a flavor, and the Cossacks are great flavor. These idea of these sort of horse soldiers that are never off their horse. And he even describes them as, the mustachioed, furred helmet type of people that are attributed, and certainly in modern themes and Hollywood themes, constantly shown as Cossacks. Iron Shadows in the Moon is a story written by Howard in which Conan loses a part of his army, his free company, but eventually he rescues the girl from an ancient evil. It's a popular theme for him. Go Conan. Koth. Now Koth is interesting because it sort of is described as having knights and armor and a little bit of a chivalry. It's in an odd position on the whole pantheon of the Hyborian age, but I would attribute it more to Arabia during the Crusades. Perhaps it has a more of a Christian theme of the remains of Constantinople, but it also just seems more like it's Sassanid Persians. It's what happened after the Crusades were kicked out of the Holy Land, kicked out of Levant, kicked out of Palestine. There were these different countries that were coming in, and even the Tartars and even a Mongol state of the Tamarins, I believe they were called, were coming into that area. Gosh, there's a lot of different kingdoms that have tried to take over Syria. And so you have Koth, essentially, and Koth is the place he ends up, in the story on the Black Colossus. So it has a little bit of that Eastern mythos flair to it, the high towers, but it also has a little bit more of an overall emperor and bureaucracy that you would see in a remains of Constantinople or Sassanid Empire, the Persians. Kush. Now, Kush is actually in a historic place. It's in southern Egypt. It's part northern Sudan and part southern Egypt. It's always was involved in an ivory and gold trade, just like its historic counterpart. It's big on the slave trade. A lot of the slaves that were in the ancient world were actually funneled along the Nile and up from Kush, and Kush was the intermediary of the people that were big slave traders. There was always a threat of a slave revolt that is mentioned in the Conan Saga that they're worried about in Kush, and that sort of has the roots of Spartacus, even though Spartacus was a Thracian slave in Italy. Again, we go back to our Gibbon, and we go back to our Thucydides, we go back to all of our modern writers talking about ancient Rome. But the Snout in the Dark is among other stories that mention him crossing this place north to enter Stygia. And historically, that's what would happen if you're in the land of the Kush. Not to be confused with the Hindu Kush on the History of the World map. The Kush were perhaps, not precisely, but perhaps where the Queen of Sheba was for King Solomon's bride. But that area, again, it was more of a buffer state that the Egyptians and all three of their major dynasty, Old, Middle, and New dynasties, used for, again, ivory and slave trade and gold. Ophir. Ophir is interesting. I don't think it's specifically, maybe it's mentioned a little bit in the Scarlet Citadel as a story. I'd have to look that up again. It has a Teutonic Knight theme of Germany. It's mentioned as being sort of in a southern Alps type of position. It could be Bavaria, but Bavaria is more of a modern German state. It was always a state, always a Catholic state, Bavaria, sort of the thorn in the side of the Protestant Prussians for a long time. Sympathizer with Poland being a country, but it definitely more has a Teutonic sort of back from the Crusade, and knights forming their own little states and swearing vassalhood to dukes and earls because they could never decide who was the emperor, even though technically the Holy Roman Emperor controlled such a pastiche of lands. It's ridiculous. Eventually the Spanish, I think, became the Holy Roman Emperors. The remains of Charlemagne. After Charlemagne broke up Europe, Charlemagne unites Europe under one kingdom, only to see his three sons divided into three, and Europe would never become unified again until the modern age with the European Union. But you can see with Brexit, I'm dating the story here. But what's nice to see about Ophir was the fact that it really points out how Conan, even as a king, was off adventuring. I don't know how he ran his country. He obviously had some great courtiers to do it for him, but he was like Captain Kirk. Captain Kirk was never safe on the ship, like Picard. He was always out there with the away team, always out there with the landing party, and Conan the same way was always in the thick of the action. Brings us a few more. We'll get a little bit of time, but we'll be done early. Ashem, a place of ziggurats. I don't think he ever spelled the word correctly, although why would he? And even if he didn't spell it correctly, it was just that's the way that the Hyborian Age spelled it. Russian, it definitely Shem. If you look at it on the map, hopefully I'll be able to slip the map of the Hyborian Age in here without having copyright problems with the Robert E. Howard estate, which has trademarked a lot of things. They've lost control of many of the stories because they're public domain by now, but they still, are holding on, like Disney, to things that should be public domain by now. But again, you've heard me editorialize on that before. But Shem is like Russia. It's huge. The borders of Shem touch everything. I talked a little bit about how Bithynia, is China. It probably, I should say, that Shem would be like the whole country, the whole continent of Asia. The Russians were actually not the Russians. There was a Rus people that came about and formed with a common language, but Russia collectively was Avars and Bulgars and Burgundians and Magyars, Hungarians. Ethnically, these would settle in Eastern Europe and become all their own countries, and you sort of have this sort of same feel from Shem. Red Nails is set there, where Conan is leading a free company of soldiers across these many different they don't war with each other, they just don't. It's more like a collection of different peoples who live indifferent to one another until outside powers come in or some nitwit tries to unify them. It can only be one Catherine the Great that will bring them all together. Iranistan. Boy, that sounds like a joke now, but it's not, and it has nothing to do with Iran. It's in the same general area, probably, both in the Hyborian Age map and its relative position in other countries, but it's more like an ancient Babylon. It could have more trappings of an Ottoman Empire, but that would be really recent. And the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I. World War I ended during Robert E. Howard's childhood, so that would be recent history. And I doubt an author would be writing so vividly about a country that just disappeared from the modern world. He wanted to add sort of an ancient feel to it, and Babylon certainly is missing from all of the tales, unless you say it's Iranistan. These are sort of the people of the Black Circle. And people of Black Circle, an interesting story of the hero versus the magicians. If you haven't read it, it's well worth the time. But it would definitely represent what Babylon was. Babylon was the country, just that the whole area, Cimmeria later became Babylon. It's the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It's ancient land, storied cities, and you can easily add a magical overtone to it and see how Iranistan would be Babylon. Do we have any more? Couple. We have the Hyrcanian. Hyrcanian are the Mongols, but on a much smaller scale. They are horse riders, and they are, it'd probably be before there would be any sort of Mongol Khan that would lead them to conquer all of China, half the world. Yeah, the modern writers of Conan stories love Hyrcania. They delight in sort of that Asian theme. But I gotta believe that if Howard was writing any story that had Hyrcania as featured characters, he would probably make them more stereotypical as sinister. Charlie Chan. Kitai. Kitai is basically China, but a much smaller landmass. It could be Japan to some degree, a little Bushido influence there, but all landlocked. Many authors attribute Conan's refined style of fighting when he visited some sort of kung fu style monastery was based in Kitai. And that brings us to the last of the list here, Vendia. Sounds like a Empire of the Petal Throne term. Of course, Barker was influenced again by Eastern religions in eastern states, the Indian subcontinent. The Indus Valley, it's only really mentioned for elephants. If Conan was to turn in some sort of Alexander the Great and try to conquer the whole of the world, as some of the stories were trying to suggest, it would appear. But otherwise, it's just another exotic place name to mention at the end of stories. Now Conan is off to steal from the markets of Vendia, or take his company down and see if he can find work among the warring princes of India. Well, I think that brings us to our end here. I try to throw in some maps so you can see historically where I'm talking about these places. If you're a writer yourself, yeah, it's not stealing to adapt and take not just the ideas of others, but use the references available. Certainly with the internet and with Google Maps, you've got these marvelous things you can bring up. Either set because the geography hasn't changed much for the 10,000 years that humans were building villages. And if you take some of those maps, I certainly do in Outlands. You can see in the latest one I'm putting together now for examples in online play. It's based in southern Russia in the Caucasus region, and the players are seeking to unify it. Conan's all. So until next time, enjoy.